Hello YouTube. Today I'll tell you about a very interesting place, and it's called the Kremlin. And the Kremlin is the most mystical place in Moscow. Inexplicable forces are concentrated in it. They predetermined the fate of the contemporary Russian people's ancestors, and they still influence modern life. There's an old legend about the primordial center, which is located in the Kremlin. It is a place of power, filling the city with living energy. The city will withstand any disasters and will not be destroyed if its center of origin is preserved. Many people believe this. Moscow has experienced a lot, but it has always been restored. It has not gone into oblivion. And where the primordial center is located, personifying the Scythian silver sign or alatir stone, there's a labyrinth deep underground. It was there when the Volkhvi or sorcerers secretly hid it and cast a protective spell, according to some beliefs. Whoever can find it together with the alatir stone will find immortality. It is said that in Moscow the primordial center is located under the Vodovzvodnaya tower. Some particularly zealous researchers of underground Moscow assure people that the Kremlin was originally conceived as a huge underground structure, for which a pit was dug on the side of the Borovitsky Hill, in which a whole system of tunnels, rooms and galleries was laid out, and only after that the builders began to create the ground part of the Kremlin. Then they say the dungeon plans were lost or burned on purpose. If we take into account the depth of the cultural layer, which in places reaches 7 to 8 meters inside the Kremlin, we can say with confidence that many finds were previously located on the surface of the Borovitsky Hill. However, this does not make the mysteries any less. The Moscow Kremlin is not just a majestic architectural and historical monument that has attracted attention for centuries. With its beauty and originality, there are many mysteries and legends associated with it, which invariably excite the imagination of the people who live there. Not everyone knows that the buildings of the Kremlin have an underground continuation. They say that there is a whole city down there below, and I'll try to bring you sources of such information, and of course all open sources. We don't know what's going on in the Kremlin today and how far it extends down below, although in my videos you can look stories of the so-called diggery and tales of the Moscow subways mysteries and a few other things like that. According to legend, Ivan the Terrible, Russian Tsar, hid his library in the Kremlin dungeons. At the same time, the books available in the library are said to be of magical nature. There's an opinion that this Tsar did not shy away from practicing black witchcraft and decided to hide from prying eyes the folios that helped him in his dark mystical affairs. At the same time, he allegedly put a curse on the black books so that they would not get to others. It is said that having hidden the library, the autocrat, the Russian Tsar, ordered a monk who helped him to be walled up in the wall. Subsequently, the ghost of the monk appeared to Ivan IV at night and drove him into a frenzy. The restless soul of a monk has been bothering state residents, employees for several centuries in a row. Once one of the Kremlin officials stayed in his office long after midnight. Suddenly a breeze swept through the room with the doors and windows closed, touching the papers lying on the table. Then small objects fell noisily to the floor. A crystal ashtray shattered. It is not difficult to imagine the state of mind of that civil servant. And we'll get back to the Ivan IV, because not everyone is as simple as it sounds. And there were more complicated matters. According to people who serve in the presidential residence, the monk's ghost continues to roam the Kremlin premises to this day. They say that after midnight, with the doors closed, a breeze suddenly sweeps through the office, stirring the papers lying on the table. Okay? And then small objects fall to the floor with a noise. Crystal vases and ashtrays break. Well, I want to tell you a little bit more about Ivan IV now, and we'll go on to other Tsars as well. But there is a very interesting hypothesis that the British spies of the time were able to cause his death. And please see my video about it in the playlist that I'll attach to this video, because Russia's history has been very complicated, bloody and complicated. But also there were detractors, and some of them quite capable, who acted in the heart of the Russian nation. So, but there are other rumors related to what I told you about the monk. They say, also tell about a small figure dressed in a long skirted overcoat, which after clear steps and the clearly audible clink of the key in the lock, was seen slowly receding and disappearing into thin air. This took place in an old building located not far from the patriarchal chambers. There are also other appearances of ghosts. There are rumors about the existence of an underground red square located right there under the ground. They say that above that underground square there was a sky with stars like in a planetarium, and directly under the mausoleum there was electrical equipment which had quite a huge capacity to it. It is difficult to say when the underground city was created and what it was intended for. Judging by the story of one of the Orthodox hierarchs who visited this mysterious place, its construction dates back to the 1940s and 1950s. At that time, there were serious concerns related to the outbreak of the Third World War, and this structure could become a refuge from the colossal nuclear weapons impact on Russia. The very presence of dungeons in the Kremlin is not an out of the ordinary phenomenon, as they are inherent in many ancient buildings. Ammunition was stored in them, they hid from enemies in those dungeons. Surprise is caused by strange things that are found in the dungeons or catacombs. As a rule, treasure chests, the library of Ivan the Terrible, warehouses with weapons, and even the Holy Grail were searched for in the dungeons of the Kremlin. But they found something completely different. For example, skeletons and armor, human remains, instruments for torture, shackles, a cube with unusual symbols, probably intended for divination. But the strangers were the following findings. These are, for example, the weapons of Napoleon's soldiers and a bottle of wine made in the 19th century. In 1985, workers in the dungeons located in the area of the Chudov monastery found a coffin with a doll as tall as a man in ceremonial clothes, a doll. Some people associate this find with the burial of Prince Romanov Sergei Alexandrovich, who died from the explosion of a bomb thrown by terrorists into a carriage, and when nothing was left of the body. Now, about the Tainitskaya Tower, we'll be coming back to this tower, but it is assumed that it was connected by an underground passage to the bank of the Moskva River in order to have access to water during the siege, or many sieges that took place in Moscow. According to rumors, there was also a cast passage that took place under the river itself. Nevertheless, so far no underwater tunnels have been found near the Kremlin, as far as we know. Legend has it that there were caches in the Tainitskaya Tower for storing chests of gold, part of the strange state treasury. there are also reports of mysterious halo. There's a belief that under it there's a narrow vertical crevice that stretches so deep that it reaches the boiling bowels of the earth. Legend says that the secret sacrifices were made in this place. They were intended to feed with the blood the underground force designed to unite Russia. But again, we're dealing with a lot of rumors. As for the so-called wolf, wolf is the sorcerer, is a representative of a separate class of people who had great influence in ancient times. The sorcerer. In Russia, the sorcerers were called priests who served the gods in temples, as well as magicians and fortune tellers. In ancient times, Borovitsky Hill, on which the Moscow Kremlin stands, had a different name, Witch Mountain. There was a Vedic sanctuary of the living gods of the ancestors of the Slavs, of the Vyatichi, the temple of the seven gates, and the main deity was the revered Perun. It was not by chance that this place was chosen for the sanctuary. The hill is located on a promontory at the confluence of two rivers, the Moskva River and the Neglinka, next to a powerful fault in the earth crust. It just passes under the red square. Please see my video about the secrets of the Neglinka. I think you will like it. Well, it was a convenient portal between the reality, the world of the living, and the non-reality, the world of the dead, the world of ancestors, heroes, and gods of the modern Russian people. Later, there was also a cemetery of the sorcerers, who were in charge of sacred knowledge and magic. Over time, the burial of the sorcerers was replaced by Orthodox cemeteries. The territory of the Kremlin is a gigantic churchyard with centuries-old history. Researchers of antiquity believe that at least 6,000 people have been buried on the territory of the Kremlin since the 12th century. To date, two of the Kremlin necropolises and cemeteries have been preserved. The necropolis of the Assumption Cathedral with the crypts of the Metropolitans, and the necropolis of the Archaeological Cathedral, where the burials of the Russian Tsars and the women from the Rurikhovich and the Romanov dynasty are located. Transferred from the Ascension Monastery, the former tomb for women of the royal family, and it was destroyed by Bolsheviks, the demons who gained control over Russia in 1917, the communists. There was a place of public executions on the Red Square. There was a debtor's prison under the Zemstvo order or agency. And the robbery and the murder cases were handled by the so-called robbery order or agency, which was located in the Konstantino Leninsky Tower of the Kremlin. The investigation in that cruel, desperate time, a time of terrible upheavals and bloody strife, was always accompanied by torture, hence the second name of the tower, Pytoshna, or torture. Often the bodies of those tortured in the robbery agency were thrown into the moat at night. In the Soviet era, the sentries in the Spassky Gate on death, endless supernatural autumn-winter nights sometimes froze with horror. Hearing from the side of the Konstantino Leninsky Tower sounds that made the hair move on their heads, either howling of the wind or moans and heart-rending screams of people. Here's another case not far from the same Konstantino Leninsky Tower, which occurred in 1950. On a summer night, a Kremlin military student found a dark spot on the stone wall, extremely resembling blood. The spot first increased in size, and then slowly, as it were alive, began to float down until it disappeared into the ground without a trace. Again, there are many legends associated with the Kremlin. Some officials from the Kremlin administration admitted that working in the presidential residence at night is below anyone's pleasure. From time to time, they hear some strange, nerve-wracking sounds. In the 1960s, an officer on duty in an old building next to the patriarchal chambers sounded the alarm. He could hear the footsteps and the clink of the key in the lock quite clearly. Then the front door slammed. When the officer jumped out into the street, he saw a small shape figure in a long skirted greatcoat, which slowly was disappearing into the thin air. At one time, one of the apartments on the second floor of this building was occupied by the People's Commissariat of the NKVD, or Ministry of the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB, the secret police. And that's where Comrade Yezhov was situated. This, of course, is not the only case of the appearance of the ghost of that red executioner. The Bolsheviks, this hungry pack of punishers, they surrounded the country's chief inquisitor, Joseph Stalin, and they are said to be walking around sometimes alive. Well, the monstrous atrocities committed by them, those protectors of Soviet socialism and communist ideology during their lifetime, apparently made their soul so heavy that they simply cannot move to other subtle worlds. So they wander around in the Kremlin inside the mystical triangle. Ghosts on the territory of the Kremlin and in the Kremlin cathedrals were seen at different times and treated this. It was as an inevitable manifestation of the spiritual worlds, and they were treated with respect and mystical awe. Interesting, for example, in 1607, the guards at the Cathedral of Michael the Archangel, the Grand Dukes and royal tombs, they heard voices and light flickered in the windows of the cathedral. It was heard how someone read the funeral prayers, then the church was filled with sobs. The terrified guards, looking into the cathedral, did not find anyone there, nor did they find the light source, but in the morning they reported the incident to the authorities. So, with the time, the Kremlin churchyards grew, and soon the Kremlin became crowded with the living next to the dead. In the 17th century, Russian Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich vetoed new burials of the deceased in the Kremlin. There is an account, but it has not been proven, that the transfer of the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg to the swampy banks of the Neva River was due precisely to the unwillingness of the first Russian Emperor Peter the Great to put up with an inconvenient, ghostly neighborhood. However, after the death of Peter, his successors returned to ancient Moscow the high status of a capital city, but not for long. A few years later, the imperial court returned to St. Petersburg. Catherine the Great, the empress, tried to solve the problem, and apparently she succeeded. In the 1780s, on the site of the cemetery of the 17th century and the church of the Kozma and Damian of the 14th century, the Senate building was built, in fact being a giant amulet which reduced the phenomena of phantoms to a minimum. In terms of the Senate building, it is an isosceles triangle with a pentagram inscribed in it. To some people it signified the most powerful magical symbol in its power. Well, now the first Kremlin building with the office and personal apartment of the president is located in the Senate building. There are rumors about the existence of an underground city under the Kremlin, and I need to repeat it again. You see, an old priest before his death said the following. One day he heard confession of a dying electrical engineer who in the early 1960s worked in one of the Kremlin technical offices and had the highest security clearance. Once he and 3 other colleagues were called and sent to perform urgent repair work in the Kremlin. As a result, they did not get into the Kremlin itself, but into the underground city under it. Under the Red Square there was another Red Square, an underground one, very similar to the upper one, but not in everything. Above the underground Red Square there was even an artificial sky with stars, like a planetarium. And under the mausoleum, again, there was a high-power electrical equipment, and clearly it was not intended for the preservation of Vladimir Lenin's mummified body. When it was built, and why the underground structure was needed remains a mystery. Once, in a private conversation, one of the Orthodox hierarchs who personally visited that mystical dungeon said that it was built in the 1940s and 1950s. Then they seriously expected the beginning of Third World War, like I said, with the use of nuclear weapons. A world that would plunge the whole planet into darkness. So, this underground city was not an ordinary, albeit colossal, bomb shelter. This was something completely unheard of in the history of the Russian state. I should say in the Soviet state. The underground city seems to be a logical result of an unprincipled struggle of power, criminal repressions in which the country's leadership and state security bodies are guilty. And it took place in the 1930s through early 1950s. Those are events that took place in the history of the Soviet Union, my motherland. These events reflected the ambitions and demonic essence of Stalin and other leaders of the people and promoters of collectivism, as well as the struggle and frenzied clashes for power that were continuously going on inside their entourage. At that time, the state propaganda worked flawlessly, and these confrontations were always covered up with loud and false slogans. Fight against deviations in the ruling party, fight against the enemies of the people, building communism, and so forth. But it also turned out to be a genocide, and millions of innocent people were victims of those power struggles. How did Soviet archaeologists study the underground Kremlin? Well, it was very interesting. There was an attempt in 1894, and the case was picked up by the official of special assignments, Prince Nikolai Sherbatov. So you see, in the Nabatnaya Tower, he found the entrance to the walled-up gallery going to the Konstantino-Leninsky Tower. A counter-vaulted corridor 62 meters long was found in the Konstantino-Leninsky Tower. At the end of the gallery, behind the brickwork, they found a cache of cannonballs. Later, Sherbatov dismantled the floor in the alarm room and found a passage leading to this hiding place from the other side. Exploring the corner arsenal, Sherbatov, like Osipov, could not penetrate further. Well, that's very interesting, because the dungeons of the Moscow Kremlin have been attracting the attention of archaeologists and historians for many years. Research and excavations have been carried out repeatedly, but the underground Kremlin still keeps a lot of secrets, and you can understand that archaeologists will not be allowed to go just anywhere they want to. The Moscow Kremlin from time immemorial was not only the symbol of a sovereign power, but also a place about which the legends were composed. While not all of them appeared from scratch, many are based on real documents, reports, and notes of the so-called serving people, or people who serve the state in various agencies. And hundreds of years of archaeology have not given up hope of penetrating the secrets of the dungeons. So, let me now go back. They tried to investigate those dungeons 3 times, and each time the excavations were stopped from the powers that be. The first attempt in the autumn of 1718 was made by the bell ringer in the church of John the Baptist on Presnya. His name was Conan Osipov. Referring to the words of the clerk, bell ringer of the great treasury Vasily Makarev, who in 1682, by the order of Princess Sophia, descended into the secret passage leading from the Tainitskaya Tower to the Sabakina corner arsenal. He allegedly saw chambers filled with chests. So, the bell ringer asked Prince Romodanovsky, he asked his permission to look for them. But you see, the deacon, the official, that's the right description, the official who brought all this information forth, he was no longer alive. So this is how the search started, and it's a very complicated matter through the century. But people ask themselves, what kind of energy does the Kremlin radiate, standing on the ruins of an ancient temple and an old fortress? And is it by chance that the heart of Russia is located there? Well, if you look at the geological map of Moscow, some mystical connections become obvious, at least to some researchers. A star with divergent fault stars is clearly visible. Moscow is located in the middle of the star, and the Kremlin is in its very center. Such coincidences are never accidental. Randomness is something that doesn't really exist in the world, and in the Borovitsky Hill area, natural anomalies are observed. For example, a hurricane is raging nearby, but everything is quiet in that area of the Borovitsky Hill. Frequent occurrences of fireballs have been noticed in the Kremlin or above the Kremlin. The nature of these clumps of energy is still unknown, and if we consider that this phenomenon is extremely rare, then this fact in itself belongs to the category of the unexplained. So, many strange deeds were committed in the Kremlin. So, after the first attempt that I told you about, let's get to the second one. So, in the Tanitskaya Tower, the bell ringer found the entrance to the gallery, which had to be excavated, and they even gave him a soldier to accompany him, but there was a danger of collapse. The work was curtailed. Well, 6 years later, Osipov returned to the search by the decree of Peter the Great. The bell ringer was allocated for the work, some prisoners, but the search was not crowned with success. In the arsenal corner, Osipov found the entrance to the dungeon, which was flooded with water from a spring. After 5 meters, he came across an arsenal post, and breaking it in the middle, rested against the rock. 10 years later, he conducted more excavation inside the Kremlin, but he was defeated again. So this brought us to the further investigation, and I told you about the Prince Nikolai Sherbatov already. But when the prince tried to break through the underground gallery from the side of the Alexander Garden, the passage went under the Trinity Tower and led to a small chamber with stone vaults, on the floor of which there was a hatch leading to the same room below. The upper chamber was connected by a corridor to another room. From the second ward or room began a low tunnel that went into the wall. Under the Borovitskaya Tower, Sherbatov found a chapel, a dungeon under the branch fortification, a passage that led to the Imperial Square, so-called shoe-sole battles that allowed to keep the space near the tower and the chamber used for gatherings under fire. Okay, so this is how they could control the situation if they needed to use weapons to get rid of the enemy. Well, after the revolution, the Bolsheviks, the communists, they came to power and grabbed power and immediately took care of the citadel security. They seized photographs of the passages from Sherbatov, filled up the well in the Tanitskaya Tower, walled up the lower chambers. After a Red Army soldier fell into the ground in the courtyard of the government building in the autumn of 1933, the archaeologist Ignatiy Steletsky was invited to explore the dungeons. At one time, he put forward the hypothesis that the well of the Tanitskaya Tower was once dry, and there were passages from it. His excavations of the Osipov passage, and I told you about Osipov, under the corner of the arsenal led to discoveries. An unloading arch was found under the wall. An exit to the Alexander Garden was opened, which was immediately walled up. But then Steletsky ran into a block of stone. He believed that the passage was free from the ground further, but the scientist was forbidden to excavate in order to clear the dungeon of the corner arsenal to the bottom. It turned out that the spring which flooded the dungeons every now and then was enclosed into a stone well with a diameter of 5 meters and a depth of 7. It was cleared to the bottom in 1975. Archaeologists found in it 2 military helmets, stirrups, and fragments of chainmail of the end of the 15th centuries. A spillway was arranged at the bottom of the well, which was supposed to protect the container from overflow. Well, after clearing it, the flooding problem stopped. In addition to archaeologists, builders, people who work in the construction in the Kremlin area, they also made discoveries. In 1930, on Red Square, they found an underground passage in which several skeletons and armor were found. At a depth of 5 meters, it went from the Spasskaya Tower and had a brick walls and a wrought iron vault. The passage was immediately covered with earth. In 1960, noticing a microscopic crack in the Lenin's mausoleum, the architects began to find out the reason and found an underground passage under the mausoleum with the height of a human being and a depth of 15 meters. In June of 1974, archaeologists discovered an intra-wall passage near the middle arsenal tower. Behind the brickwork, a 15th century staircase filled with the earth opened, and it led to some tunnels. A year later, a gallery was found near the so-called alarm tower, going from there to the Spasskaya Tower, but the beginning and end of the gallery could not be found. However, this is not everything. After all, the territory of the Kremlin is quite large. For example, in 1882, a cave opened in the middle of the road between the Tsar Cannon and the walls of the Chudov Monastery. 3 policemen could walk along it in a row. One end of the tunnel rested against the wall of the Chudov Monastery, and the other was littered with stones. When digging the foundation of the Annunciation Monastery in 1840, cellars and underground passages with piles of human remains were found. They tell about a whole road passing under the Annunciation Cathedral. Here in the cathedral, Prince Sherbatov opened a hiding place that could lead further. So, when the prince cleared the debris from space under the floor and reached the mosaic floor, which could easily be the vault of an underground tunnel of structure, the mysterious iron door, allegedly located in the dungeon between the Annunciation and the Archangel Cathedral, remains a mystery. From time to time, it is said that Vladimir Lenin, Russian Soviet dictator, appears on the inner territory of the Kremlin at night, and it became the regular, and it has become a regular in the ancient Moscow citadel from 1924. It was then that his phantom was seen first. Especially often the ghost of the communist leader likes to visit his former offices in the Kremlin, which now houses a museum. A pale woman with a pistol in her hand, it is said, lives on the wall and in the commandant's tower. This is Fanny Kaplan, who was personally executed by the then Kremlin Commandant Malkov. According to the official account, it was she who shot the communist dictator Lenin with poisoned bullets. Shadows and shrouds are seen in the corridor of the Kremlin Palace, formerly called the Kremlin Palace of Congresses. There was a cemetery there, on the site of which the palace was built. Well, the remains were loaded directly into trucks by excavators and taken directly to the landfill. This was during the Soviet times. Well, a question to the residents of the new district was, where do you think these landfills were located, and what is now under your houses? At night in the Assumption Cathedral, they hear children crying. The reason is the souls of the murdered infant sacrificed to the pagan gods in the temple, which was once located on the site of the temple. See, those are legends that swirl around Moscow. There's also the shadow of the false Dmitri, the young man who attempted to be the Russian king, but it didn't work out. Apparently it appears on the Kremlin wall. It was spotted actually first in August of 1991. The would-be Tsar was making hand gestures. The meaning of the signals became clear only in the next morning when the appeal of the State Emergency Committee sounded, and when they attempted coup d'etat against the changes in the Soviet Union, and this is when it began and ended shortly thereafter. So I already told you about the Stalin's Commissar Yezhov. So his ghost is seen in a long-skirted overcoat and a high cap in the patriarchal chambers, where the apartment that he had was located. And there are other stories. Moscow's Kremlin had a very stormy, bloody, and mystical history. There were numerous storming of the Kremlin, devastating fires, uprising, civil strife, and many people died there. And you know, I told you what I know. It's a complicated history of a very interesting and very important place in the Russian history. And I'm sure there will be more rumors and tales about Kremlin. And I'll bring you forth what I know. Please also see the videos in the other in the playlist that I will attach to the description to this video. Please support my channel. Look at the links in the description to this video. Please tell others, and stay tuned for more stories. Thank you.